If you are a strict determinist and you don't believe in free will, you have zero business praising anybody for moral excellence or blaming anybody for moral wickedness. There isn't anything like moral wickedness, really. So you have to say, it seems to me, you can't condemn Hitler.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the senior publishing director at Word on Fire. Can everything in the world be reduced to atoms bumping against each other and chemical reactions in our brains? Or is there something more to reality than its material elements? Well, a new book argues that there is more, and that's what we'll be discussing today with Bishop Barron, who joins us from Rochester. Bishop, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon. Always a joy to see you.
I was just with you for the last 3 days. I got home last night, but we were in Rochester, your diocese there, for an extraordinary conference called the New Ressourcement Conference, which Word on Fire Academic hosted. Tell us about that.
We're launching a new journal called the New Ressourcement. And people that have followed me know that as you survey the different theological movements over the past many years, I kind of tend in this direction of what's called classically the Ressourcement, or the going back to the sources movement. Think of de Lubac, think of Danielu, think of Balthasar, think of Ratzinger, think of Wojtyła, all those people from the mid-20th century who impacted Vatican II in a big way. Think of the Catechism of 92 as very much influenced by the Ressourcement, sometimes called the Nouvelle Théologie, the new theology. It was new back in the 50s, you know. Well, I think what's needful today is a kind of new Ressourcement. It's a revisiting of that movement, but now in a fresh way, addressing particular issues we have today. So we launched the journal in a lovely way by having a conference up here with, I think, some of the very best people writing today in Catholic theology. We had, a 3 or 2.5 day conference. I gave a keynote at the beginning, despite my hoarse voice from the trip to Rome, talking about what I mean by a new Ressourcement. And then there were just a whole slew of papers that were really good, and I was able to take in a lot of it. I was still trying to run my diocese, but I was able to get over for a number of the talks. So it was a great joy.
Big thanks to Jason Payon, the editor of Word on Fire Academic, Rachel and Jason Bullman, who helped coordinate it, and Doug Cummins and our excellent production team helped put it on. Mary Emily as well helped with the logistics. So big success. We'll have a lot coming from that conference soon. Videos of the talks. The talks themselves will be published in the initial issues of the New Ressourcement Journal, which will debut in 2024. So look forward to that. Well, today, Bishop, let's wrap up our discussion on Justin Brierley's new book, which I'm just a huge fan of. I encourage people to pick it up. It's called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God: Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. Today, we're going to focus on one of the final chapters titled Mind, Meaning, and the Materialists, which compares two dominant ways that people view the world today. On the one hand, you have materialism, which maintains that the natural world is all that there is and everything can ultimately be explained in terms of physical stuff. And Christianity, which sees a transcendent God behind and above our material world, and a God who imbues it with purpose and meaning. So let's start with materialism. Brierley claims that materialism is the background assumption that most people in the West live by today, that nature is a machine and that we're insignificant cogs within it, that there's no ultimate value to the choices we make, that we are simply being herded along by a vast, undirected, uncaring universe. Would you agree that this is the default view among most people today? And either way, what's the problem with materialism?
Well, first, I think, yes, for a lot of young people, it is. And I've called it scientism, right? Which is not the view that science is a good thing. We all hold to that. Scientism is the view that reality can be reduced to what the sciences can investigate. So, and I think that's born of the great success of the sciences. People legitimately say, scientists are great. Look what they've given us, the technology. Look at their accuracy, how they predicted things and how they've helped us with our health. And so we're so impressed by the sciences that we take that extra step which is really an illogical step to say, well, therefore, that's all there is to reality. Science has an exhaustive command of reality. So I do think, indeed, it's a default position of a lot of people. And if the scientists can't talk about it, well, then it's just old nonsense. It's old pre-scientific superstition, right? So then religion gets swept away. But they often don't realize, you start making that move, it's not just religion gets swept away. It's like almost everything else we hold to be valuable gets swept away. How about ethics? You can't determine ethics by scientific investigation. How about beauty? What makes something beautiful? Why do you bother making something beautiful if everything just comes down to what the sciences can affirm? Justice, questions of justice, right and wrong, what makes a city just or unjust? That can't be determined scientifically. So the trouble with the scientism is it ends up brushing aside much of what makes life wonderful. That's the first thing, by the way, that's wrong with it. But the second more fundamental thing is it's a contradictory view. When I was a young philosophy student, we all read A.J. Ayer, who was the father of what's called logical positivism. That's the view that that only things that can be verified empirically are meaningful. So you make a statement like, I'm sitting here in the Word on Fire studio. Well, that's a meaningful statement because I can empirically verify it or falsify it. Or there were, so many people at our Word on Fire conference last week. Well, that's a meaningful statement because I can verify it empirically. Things like, that's not the right thing to do. Or, no, I think that city is unjust. Or God said something. Those aren't so much wrong as meaningless statements for the logical positivists. They're just, it's like gobbledygook because they can't be verified empirically. Okay, what's the problem? The problem is, where do you empirically verify the principle that only empirically verifiable things are true? I'll wait for my answer because obviously you can't. There's an operational self-contradiction in saying all that's meaningful are empirically verifiable statements. That's not an empirically verifiable statement. And there's a similar problem, Brandon, always with forms of radical materialism. Because the very act of making that statement moves you beyond a purely materialistic view. If I say all reality is reducible to the material, well, I've just made a philosophical statement, which cannot be verified empirically or with reference to the material world. So in denying there's something beyond the material, I've affirmed there's something beyond the material. That's the operational contradiction involved in forms of radical materialism.
A very closely related view to materialism is determinism, sometimes described as the stepchild of materialism. And a lot of these new atheist figures that we've been covering in our discussions were big proponents of determinism. Determinism holds that everything that is happening in the world is completely determined by previous existing causes. So this implies that free will is an illusion, that we're not really free to think or to act as we choose. Everything we do or believe is determined by outside factors. As a Catholic, you obviously reject determinism. You believe in free will. But why? What's troubling about determinism?
Well, a lot of things. It's born of a kind of Newtonian version of this materialism. So some of the Newtonians would have said, take any object in the universe, give me its position, give me its speed, give me certain factors. I will tell you infallibly where that thing's going to be in 10,000 years, right? So, within a sort of materialist Newtonian view of things, determinism seems to hold sway. One problem, Brandon, is that it's so scientifically dated, that stuff. Newton, we're talking about 18th century, but the quantum people today, read someone like John Polkinghorne, who keeps pressing this point, that the quantum world is a much more open-ended world than the one Newton gave us. And even if you want to look at it just materialistically, the quantum world leaves so much room for indeterminacy and for possibility and probability and so on. It seems to open up these cracks into which something like indeterminism or something like freedom or even God's intervention could be understood. So in a way, it's bad science. But here's another perspective. If you are a strict determinist and you don't believe in free will, you have zero business praising anybody for moral excellence or blaming anybody for moral wickedness. There isn't anything like moral wickedness, really. So you have to say, it seems to me, you can't condemn Hitler. You can't. If you're a strict determinist, there's no free will. Hitler's just this poor guy that was determined from the time he was born to act the way he did. You can't praise Mother Teresa. You can't praise any, let's say you're not even a religious person, but pick a hero of yours that you really admire. You can't praise that person. You shouldn't. It's a category error. Well, that's just so deeply counterintuitive, right? Our instinct is that, no, of course, moral praise and blame can and should be assigned. So there's kind of a, I think, dated science problem with it. And then there's this repugnance we have to the view that I can't morally blame or morally praise.
In his book, Justin Brierley traces a lot of these prominent materialists and determinists, a group that overlaps with the new atheists we've been discussing. But then he shows how, interestingly, a lot of high-level thinkers have recently changed course and have abandoned materialism. This includes the psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist, the philosopher Thomas Nagel, and the novelist Philip Pullman. Now, none of those men are now religious, but they've each recognized that materialism fails to account for many facts of the world. And I want to talk about some of these facts with you. One of them is consciousness. That was a big one for a lot of these figures. Consciousness seemed to be what undercut their materialism. What is consciousness, and why does it present a problem for materialists?
Call it a reflexive self-awareness of both inner and outer states might be a definition of consciousness. We all experience it, right? Refer to it very readily, but you might characterize it that way. But here's the thing, Brandon, about consciousness, which is, it's very interesting. It's a very old problem. If all we've got going on in the mind are just atoms buzzing around or just states, chemical and physical states within the brain, things like judgment, I don't mean moral judgment so much here, but intellectual judgment can't be made sense of. When someone makes a judgment, you're considering a variety of scenarios. You're trying to explain something. You say, well, here's scenario A, B, C, D. I've considered them, and now I've made a judgment, a determination that I think that one is most correct. That one's in line with reality. There has to be something in your mind that transcends these merely physical states if you're able to make a judgment in regard to them. Secondly, there has to be a freedom in regard to that judgment. If I'm just determined, I have to decide that's the right scenario, well then why would I have confidence that I've made a correct judgment? But if I have a certain freedom vis-a-vis these various scenarios, and I say freely, having looked at the evidence, I say that's the right one, now I'm in possession of a real act of consciousness. I've made a real rational judgment. And I can say, this really is my opinion on the matter. It's hard to make sense of that move unless we can find some distance between the merely physical scenarios under consideration and this one who makes the judgment, this conscious self that makes the judgment. Aquinas wouldn't play it exactly that way. Aquinas would put a great stress on the mind's capacity for pure intellection. So the mind takes in the physical world through the senses. These hands and these eyes, which are just extensions of the body, right, out into the world. So it takes in the data of the senses. But then the mind is capable of abstracting from sense data what he would call form or intelligible pattern. So when I say, looking at you, I say, well, Brandon is a human being, and he has his humanity in common with lots of other human beings that I could name. What's the mind done there? It's not simply seen you or seen other human beings. It's abstracted from what Thomas calls the phantasm. That means the kind of the memory of a perception. It's abstracted from that phantasm an intelligible pattern. Now, the intelligible pattern cannot be reduced to matter. If it could, well, then it wouldn't apply to all these different instances. If I identify you with humanity, well, then that's all I'm going to see. You're the fullness of humanity. What I've done is I've abstracted from my experience of you and a variety of others this pure, intelligible pattern. That's not material. Think when this strikes me as interesting because we do it all the time, is you're moving through your day and you're reading signs, traffic signs, or there's something on your computer, or none of those letters, all those letters A or L or M that you see, none of them is in the same physical configuration. They're all different fonts, we would say, different colors, different sizes, different styles, right? The M I might see on a traffic sign, the M I would see on my computer screen, the M I would see in the newspaper. They're all different, but yet, weirdly, because I couldn't read otherwise, I recognize an intelligible pattern that I call the letter M. But that pattern is not any of those particular M's, right? It's a pure intelligible pattern. The mind is able to entertain and hold on to those. And that, says Aquinas, is the sign that the mind, at least in those higher faculties, has an immaterial dimension. It's not reducible to sense experience or memory. And so that would be his way of saying that consciousness, in its full ramification, indicates the immateriality of the mind.
You hinted at this a moment ago when talking about judgment, but we might situate judgment under the more general category of rationality. And what Brierly covers in his book is the number of former materialists who abandoned materialism because they could not therefore make sense of rationality, how we freely come to believe certain things. He gives this famous quote from C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis himself, who was a materialist and then became a Christian later on. Lewis says, suppose there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It is merely that when the atoms inside of my skull happen for physical or chemical reasons to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me, as a byproduct, the sensation that I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. But if I can't trust my own thinking, he says, of course, I can't trust the arguments that lead to atheism, and therefore I have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought. So I can never use thought or rationality to disbelieve in God. What do you make of that line of reasoning?
Well, there's a lot there. And as you know, there's a whole literature around that argument that Lewis kind of sums up a lot that came before him. And in his typical verve, he sums that up. And there's been a lot of debate since then. Elizabeth Anscombe, the famous Catholic moral philosopher, super smart lady, went to the Socratic Club when Lewis laid out a version of that argument, and she took issue with it, And some say it had a big impact on Lewis, others say it really didn't, but she took issue with it. What would I say? I think there's something right if by rationality, as he's pursuing it there, you mean these higher Thomistic moves that I was just referencing. I'm not sure, because I think a materialist might say in answer to that, the brain is not just random firings of atoms, but rather it's this developed organ that has evolved through the evolutionary demands of time and space and all that into being an organ capable of discerning and responding to the real world. Now, in its higher functions, I think the Lewis argument holds more water. If you get to the higher forms of rationality that involve real abstraction and involve the real perception of intelligible patterns, I think that's much harder to explain through simple recourse to brain function. There's something qualitatively different going on in the mind when it does something like make a judgment or intuit an intelligible pattern. I think these higher realms that Lewis invokes, I think, are legitimately at play.
Another difficulty for materialism that pops up among these new thinkers that Brierley covers is beauty, right up our alley here at Word on Fire. Brierley quotes a young Australian man named Robbie who abandoned his faith in college thanks to the new atheists. But then Robbie had a transcendent experience that he couldn't make sense of on materialism. He says, I remember one occasion when I nearly lost my atheism simply while listening to a Beethoven symphony and watching the sunrise over Sydney Harbor. I couldn't understand how such an experience could be explained by a material world. What is it about beauty that suggests there's something more to this world than its physical components?
Yeah, and a lot of people talk about that. Go back to Dietrich von Hildebrand, that the beautiful within this world, and Plato saw the same thing, the beautiful in this world opens us up to, it triggers an awareness of the source of beauty. Now, how come? We'll keep it anchored in what we've been talking about, intelligibility and form and so on. Because what is beauty? It's not just a sentiment like, oh, that's what a pretty sight that is. Think of Aquinas, right? Integritas consonantia claritas. That when you see something as one, well, that's a movement of a high rational function, to see something as one, as united. Consonantia is to see the play of parts, how the parts harmoniously make up a whole, right? But then maybe most intriguingly, claritas, and we say brightness would be a literal sense of it, but as all the commentators point out, what Thomas really means is the splendor of form. Having seen the form, I now see the splendor of the form. I've seen deeply into the intelligibility of something in such a way that its splendor becomes apparent to me. Well, see, those are very high moves of the mind. That's way beyond like, oh, what a pretty picture, or oh, that glittery thing caught my attention. That would be at a very primitive level of the senses. Necessary, often to get your attention, but then as you meditate upon a beautiful thing, you're moving into these very high levels of intellection, because you have to be able to see consonantia and claritas, both of which involve perception of form. And so in that sense, it triggers an awareness of this higher world. The form on display in this particular face or particular person or particular move in sports, right? What a beautiful golf swing that is, or what a beautiful fast break that was. What are you noticing but a splendor of form? Well, that means your mind's been engaged at a very high level, right? And then do the whole Platonic thing where the splendor of form here below then leads us to a contemplation of the light in which all intelligibility appears. Read Lonergan now on that score. So that makes sense to me. And it's not just what a pretty scene. I have nice feelings about it. See, that would be a way of reducing it to sentimentality. But when you see, as he mentions there, the sunset, or what was the other one, the Beethoven, right? That's what's happening. Is your consciousness, your intellection is being engaged at a very high level.
Well, finally, Brierley turns to the topic of meaning. He tells the story of several atheists who experience moments of transcendent meaning, whether it be through love or beauty, and they couldn't account for these experiences on materialism. One example he gives is our longtime friend Jennifer Fulwiler, who converted to Catholicism back in 2007 at the height of the new atheism. Similar to Dorothy Day, it was Jennifer's experience of having a child that poked a hole in her materialism. She recounted, I looked down and I thought, what is this baby? And I thought, well, from a purely atheist materialist perspective, he's a collection of randomly evolved chemical reactions. And I realized if that's true, then all the love that I feel for him, it's nothing more than chemical reactions in my brain. And I looked down at him and I realized that's not true. That's not the truth. Why can't chemical reactions in our brain fully explain these experiences of deep love or meaning?
Yeah, and of course that's the way the atheists would want to do it. The materialists would say it's just endorphins released by the brain and grounded in the the push toward reproduction, and so when a child's born, we're flooded with these endorphins and so on. The only thing, Brandon, with regard to those things, is to say it's just not adequate to the experience. As Dorothy Day, put it, I felt a gratitude so great that it didn't correspond to anything in this world. So it wasn't like just a good feeling. It was a gratitude, and that she knew there's nothing in the universe that could adequately receive the gratitude that she felt. So am I grateful to the evolutionary process and grateful to my body and grateful to, my husband? Yeah, sure. But there's something more in the experience that I'm grateful finally to the giver of being. And I would say with a mother or father, in a mitigated way, but they have given being to something, and it triggers a connection to the giver of being itself. The Creator God. And the gratitude can only find rest in relation to that highest giver of being. So I think that's how that stuff works. It's just the quality of the experience. It just doesn't fit into a materialistic framework. It's too big. It's too big for that framework to fit.
Well, as we close here, I want to mention another example of this meaning problem among the atheists. Brierley quotes the psychologist John Vervaeke, who I think you've shared a dialogue with John before, but it was Vervaeke who coined the term meaning crisis. Vervaeke says that this crisis emerged when people move through life feeling disconnected from each other and from the world, but especially when they have a loss of a sense of purpose or a story that makes sense of who they are. And Vervaeke sees a range of symptoms to this meaning crisis: the rise in suicide, even notably suicide independent of clinical depression, people not killing themselves because they're depressed, but for other reasons, depression, anxiety disorders, the addiction crisis, the opioid crisis. Brierley argues that this meaning crisis is primarily explained by the materialist story that's winning the day in most people's minds and hearts. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, quite right. I come from nothing. I'm going to nothing. My life has no meaning. I'm just atoms bouncing around. And of course it's depressing. And it's repugnant to our deepest spiritual instincts. Now, let's construct, if you want, metaphysical arguments against that view, which I think we can indeed. And we can explore the question of teleology. And I know materialism wants to eliminate teleology. There's no such thing as purpose. We're not existing for something. But again, that's repugnant, Brandon, to our instincts. That we know, as we seek even the simplest thing, we seek it, but then it exists within a higher context. We seek that good because of a higher good. And we seek that one because of even a higher good and a higher good. Everybody in the world that seeks any particular good is inchoately seeking a summum bonum, a highest good. And now, what is that? What is that? Well, let's be honest about it. It's to be happy utterly all the time and in every possible way. It's a desire for complete peace and satisfaction. Now, put that in religious terms. We are by nature ordered to God. We're ordered to the summum bonum. And every bonum, every good that we seek, from the simplest thing, are having this conversation now. I'll have lunch in a few minutes. Those are goods that I seek. But I can put every one of them in the context of a higher good, and a higher good, and a higher good. You got to come to the summum bonum finally. And if we're honest about it, the summum bonum is God, is the infinite good. That's what I want. I'm not going to rest till I find it. Now go back to Augustine in the Bible. Only in God is my soul at rest. That's not just high poetry. That's a very, very strictly logical statement about human anthropology. It's only in God that my soul will be at rest. It's not going to be rest by anything in this world. I know that. Anyone who's lived beyond the age of 10 knows that nothing in this world satisfies that longing. So follow it all the way. Don't let the materialists shut down the natural aspiration of the soul outward toward the summum bonum. That's, I think, what a lot of these people are intuiting, is materialism shuts them into this little tiny narrow space, and their own soul, it just wars against that. And I'd say, good, bring on that fight.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. If you have one for Bishop Barron, you can record it and send it to us at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today we have one from Michael, who lives in Georgia. He's asking Bishop about contrition. Here's his question.
My name is Michael, and I'm from Georgia. My question is, if we suppose feelings are not acts of the will, what is contrition, a feeling or an act of the will, or both, or neither?
Yeah, thanks. It's both, I would say. Contritio in Latin means crushing. When you feel contrition, you feel crushed by the weight of your sin. Does that have an affective dimension? Yeah, I think it does. I think when we've done something wrong and we know it, there's a negative feeling associated with that. But I'd also say it has this more cognitive dimension. When I know I've done something wrong and I'm crushed by the shame and the guilt and the responsibility of that. That's what you bring to confession. I don't think you have to worry so much about the feeling side. Feelings come and go. They may not be there. But the contrition, the sense of I'm crushed under the weight of my moral responsibility, yeah, bring that to confession. And that's what you, in the act of contrition, right, which you're kind of obliged in some form to say in confession, that's what it's meant to do. It's meant to call that explicitly to consciousness that, yes, I am under the weight of my responsibility. So I would say it's both. It can be both, but I put the weight on the cognitive dimension.
Well, as we wrap up here, we are excited to share with you yet another new book from Word on Fire. This one's really cool and special. It's called Popcorn with the Pope, A Guide to the Vatican Film List, and it's by David Paul Baird, Andrew Petiprin, and Michael Ward. In 1995, which was exactly 100 years after the birth of cinema in Paris, a Vatican-appointed commission compiled a list of 45 significant films. It's come to be known as the Vatican Film List. The entries range widely from lighthearted favorites like The Wizard of Oz to challenging art house features such as The Seventh Seal. This list, which was released under Pope St. John Paul II, was an important milestone in the dialogue between the church and the wider culture, especially the arts. Yet, for many Catholics and cinephiles alike, it remains undiscovered or unclear. What was the list for, and why did the commission choose these particular movies? Well, in this groundbreaking study, the authors walk through the entire Vatican film list, and they show that its aim was not to serve as a best ever list of films, but rather to guide people in their appreciation of cinema as an artistic language and as a bearer of spiritual and moral messages. So pick up this book. Again, it's beautifully produced. It includes film stills, quotations, informed commentary, and much more. It's elevated, it's entertaining. Again, it's called Popcorn with the Pope. You can find it at the website wordonfire.org/popcorn. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.